Boa noite. Boa noite a todas e todos. Bem-vindos à segunda aula, segundo encontro aqui do curso com o professor Peter Krapp, que já está, então, registrando fotograficamente as nossas interações aqui. Antes de eu passar para o Peter e dar sequência aí às nossas atividades, eu estou remetendo para os alunos que estão matriculados no nosso sistema aqui da universidade alguns links com artigos, outras recomendações que o professor Peter tem feito. Se alguém não está recebendo e está matriculado, por favor, entre em contato comigo por e-mail. E também, se alguém está assistindo aqui só hoje ou não está matriculado, aí, claro, também pode me escrever ou pedir para um colega aí repassar sem problema algum. A gente também vai, aos poucos, ir disponibilizando também as apresentações, né, os slides, para vocês também poderem utilizar aí na medida do interesse. Antes então, de eu dar encaminhamento, eu ia perguntar assim, se alguém gostaria de fazer algum comentário ou ficou com alguma questão relacionada à atividade de ontem, algum aspecto que gostaria de trazer para o debate. Caso contrário, eu teria assim uma ou duas colocações para fazer. Já fiz em inglês para o Peter antes, assim, então está meio jogada ensaiada, mas se vocês tiverem alguma outra observação. Muito cedo ainda para... Tá, mas o Peter já alertou ontem, né? Vocês podem intervir mais. Então, assim, o que eu comentei com o Peter é que me chamou muito a atenção o fato de que, normalmente, a gente pensa a comunicação, talvez ainda com herança dos estudos que vêm das teorias da comunicação lá dos anos 80, quando a gente falava em comunicação de massa e da comunicação de um para muitos ou muitos para muitos, mas sempre a ideia de comunicação social, como uma comunicação que se compartilha e que não se desejaria que ela ficasse em segredo ou privatizada, né? Ou criptografada, melhor dizendo. Então, é muito sintomático, curioso o fato de que essa discussão sobre criptografia inverte essa discussão da ideia de uma comunicação que se dissemina por uma comunicação cujo cuidado é torná-la próxima ao indecifrável, né? O segundo ponto é que eu me lembrei do último livro da Wendy Chun, que se chama Updating to Remain the Same, onde ela faz um comentário em determinado momento sobre, na perspectiva dela, não se trataria mais de recuperar uma privacidade. A privacidade estaria perdida. E se trata, na verdade, de repensar como que a gente quer negociar a nossa privacidade num contexto de publicização de tudo, né? Então, isso talvez também seja... Não são questões, mas são mais comentários sobre essa ideia do reservado versus público e também do ponto de vista da comunicação. So, I hope I said in Portuguese what I told you in English, and have a great class today, and about the same time we'll have the break and everything else. I didn't get you water this time, so...
Just spill, yeah, thank you. I have no notes this time, nothing to spill on. Thank you again, thanks for coming back. So, what I think he may have been talking about is this tension, especially in digital culture, between the ability of media technologies to share very quickly and very widely, and to make things known and visible very quickly, very widely, and the fact that that's turned around and may turn against us. Yesterday, I was talking mostly about us as individuals being tracked by our mobile devices or by our web browsers and being under surveillance by marketers or corporations or governments. Not to indulge in the paranoid fantasy that spies are interested in you or in me, but the equivalent of being under surveillance, being watched, not even by people, but just by devices, by machines. Today, I want to talk about that more in a collective sense, not on the individual basis, but on the level of a whole society, because it's not just about the bourgeois individual exercising freedoms or having the right to exercise certain freedoms on the internet. There are also collective dimensions. And here in particular, I want to talk about something that is not exactly new with the internet, but something that is certainly accelerated and exacerbated by the affordances of the internet. What the internet allows to happen to what I call information ops, information operations, or what some in the field call active measures. And active measures sounds like a very ominously empty phrase, but it's a literal translation into English of a Russian phrase that I'm going to try to explain, and what encompasses quite a few dirty tricks. So this is not just propaganda. I'm not talking about propaganda, which is a much older term. Thank you, Adobe. It's propaganda historically is not necessarily negative. I know that in Spanish and Portuguese and English, now propaganda has a negative meaning, but historically it's not biased communication, but simply to propagate. Right? We are here in a Jesuit university. The Christian faith goes back to phrases that are about the propagation of the word, of beliefs, right? So propagate just means spread, share, as widely as possible. And now, of course, with newer media reaching more people in more ways and much more quickly than used to be the case with paintings or cartoons or posters or pamphlets, or even films and radio shows, maybe even more quickly and widely than TV shows. In digital culture, we have a new platform. A digital age gives rise to new ways of disseminating, of course, propaganda, still in that sense of advertising, sharing, preaching, proselytizing, through the use now also of bots and algorithms that can create computational propaganda. It becomes problematic when it spreads things that are fake news, that are false, that are calculated to sow doubt, to cause problems. And as we know, I'm not telling you anything new yet. I'm hoping I will tell you something new in a little bit, but social media are particularly good at quickly spreading things that are false because there's very little censorship. There's very little that can stop the spread of fake news on social media. So this, we all know, is a problem for politics, it's a problem for journalism, it's a problem for advertising, because it undermines all of those social institutions. It undermines the credibility of politicians. It undermines the credibility of advertising. So if you're in the business of, let's say, advertising or public relations, you should be especially be worried about what happens to propaganda. But what I'm really interested in is, in a sense, turning that around, not just the problems that propaganda has run into, that advertising, which is basically funding almost all of the internet, has run into, but the dark use of that, the inverted use of that. Now, instead of propagating the faith, you're actually propagating things that are calculated not to improve somebody's image, somebody's brand, not to spread good news, but just to cause trouble. So we're quite used to it, maybe not inured, maybe we're not immune to it, but we're quite used to the fact that there's advertising everywhere on the internet. that there's a trade-off between getting devices for free or for almost no cost, because they're paid for by advertising, by marketing, whether we see the advertising or whether we're being sold to marketers. And that has a long history, again, that predates the internet. As you might know, Sigmund Freud's son-in-law learned quite a lot from early experimental psychology and group psychology and wrote a very influential book called Propaganda in 1928, which still today reads like an interesting how-to. And according to people who are looking at public relations, what Walter Lippmann set out in a theoretical overview, Edward Bernays turned into a very hands-on how-to, and his techniques are staples for public image creations, and of course political campaigns, because what works for a brand in marketing and by a corporation also often works for creating the brand, the image of a politician. Here's a fictional quote. I don't know if you're reading novels like this, but I recommend John le Carré as one of the intelligent commentators on our current situation. Often fiction pretends to be about a different time, but it really is a commentary on our current situation. Just like I just finished a William Gibson book, a very recent William Gibson book called Agency, which is about a near future, an alternate scenario, near future where that looks back on a world that had really big problems with a virus and a stock market crash. I can't help but think that that's not science fiction. You know, William Gibson wrote that as something much more near term. But here we have a 1990 book by John le Carré, excuse me, called The Secret Pilgrim. It's an episodic novel set within the framed narrative of an informal dinner talk that George Smiley, one of his characters across many books, is giving at a spy training school. And he says to these trainees, spies, "Sometimes I think the most vulgar thing about the Cold War was the way we learned to gobble up our own propaganda," he said with the most benign of smiles. I don't mean to sound didactic, and of course in a way we had done it all through history, but in the Cold War, when our enemies lied, they lied to conceal the wretchedness of their system. Whereas when we lied, we concealed our virtues, even from ourselves, our respect for the individual, our love of variety and argument, our belief that you can only govern fairly with the consent of the governed. In our supposed ideological rectitude, we sacrificed our compassion to the great God of indifference. We protected the strong against the weak, and we perfected the art of the public lie. We made enemies of decent reformers and friends of the most disgusting potentates. And we scarcely paused to ask ourselves how much longer we could defend our society by these means and remain a society worth defending. This is episode 6 in the novel, so it's in an early stage in this dinner talk, episodic interlude. Pretty soon, Smiley gets to attack the British Secret Services for taking in all kinds of communist refugees from various opposing services. And he calls them all kinds of bad names. And in fact, I'm going to argue that those are the most interesting witnesses to what I call information operations, precisely because they're the veterans of operations directed against democratic societies, against open societies with free media. So my view is that despite what this John le Carré quote correctly points out about Western propaganda, the true masters and innovators of information ops or active measures actually came from communist and socialist countries, especially from the Russian and the Czech and the East German agencies, because they really turned active measures into an art form. There's a number of books that have reported about this. They're mostly autobiographical narratives by former Russian or Czech or East German operatives. The most interesting and most relevant ones might be The Deception Game, 1972, and The KGB and Soviet Disinformation and Insider's View from 1985, both by Ladislav Bittman, who was a very high-ranking Czech spy between 1954 and 1968, and he left Czechoslovakia and he left his service after the brutal suppression by the Soviet Union of the Prague Spring, because he felt that he could no longer work for the Czech apparatus if it wasn't serving its own national interests, if it was going to be just a cat's paw of the Soviet Union, which of course it was to an extent before, but he no longer felt comfortable in his role as second in command there and in charge of information operations. So he turns himself over to the United States, and he becomes a professor, and he ends up teaching American students about these operations. In the first book, he talks about his own successes and failures, and in the second book, he talks about Russian operations against the West. There's some similar books, and I don't expect you to read German autobiographical accounts. They're not actually that interesting. They're interesting to me, but I'm just going to give you some of the fun facts from them. But there are some East German operations that were quite successful against West Germany. As you can imagine, when there are two countries speaking the same language, but with very, very different political systems, they're going to try to maximize on what they can do inside the apparatus of the other. This is also true, of course, with Korean or other kinds of frontiers. But the Germans were making quite a lot of use of information operations against each other. So Heinz Felfe in 1986 came out with a book about his being a double agent, ostensibly working for the West, but in fact working for the East. Auftrag Irreführung is a cooperative book between two officers in East Germany. Auftrag Irreführung could be translated into English as their task was disinformation, not misinformation, but disinformation, right? Intentionally misleading, intentionally sowing problems. The subtitle is How the Stasi, the East German Secret Service, made politics in the West. And then there's also a more recent book by Horst Kopp, which is perhaps not as good, but it is again a first-person account of his role in those operations, called Der Desinformant, which is obviously the disinformant, right? So a number of books that I can draw on. So in a nutshell, if a public relations expert, a marketing an advertising public relations expert wants to improve a client's public image, whether that client is a company or a brand or a politician, the perpetrator of active measures uses very similar techniques, but in reverse, right? So the program is not calculated to make them look good, but to damage the public image of a target, to create misunderstanding, to undermine policies, to create misunderstandings about political platforms or ideas and programs. So as Bittman points out, it's hard to fully translate this Russian phrase, active measures, into other languages, because in Russian, it includes the meaning of psychological warfare, information penetration, covert action, dirty tricks of all kinds. So it makes active measures an offensive weapon in statecraft. It's disrupting relations between nations or parties or corporations or public figures. And Bittman asserts that during the Cold War, the Soviet apparatus for disinformation was undoubtedly the largest and most effective in the world, although he likes to claim that the Czech service, his own, was the most inventive, the most ingenious, and perhaps that the East Germans were the most adventurous. They took the most risks. But all of them were notoriously successful. And I'm going to give you some older examples before we get into the internet age. If we know that active measures involve a broad range of covert operations involving disinformation, black propaganda, forgeries, rumors, front organizations, so that you can blame some organization inside another country without being fingered as operating outside that, or influence agents, clandestine broadcasting, support of guerrilla groups, then maybe you won't be completely shocked. I'm trying to give you examples that are more South American than European. That in 1964, there was a forgery being circulated, of course circulated as something serious, supposedly signed by a famous German novelist, Thomas Mann. On April 29th, the Mexican weekly Siempre ran an article based on that forged document, referring to a so-called Thomas Mann plan against Latin America. Supposedly, this document called for the overthrow of the governments of Brazil, Chile, Uruguay, and Cuba, and the isolation of Mexico. The Uruguayan journal Epoca repeated that news a month later, on May 20th. Of course, Thomas Mann never wrote such a document. There's no reason that a German novelist would write a political document calling for such measures. They may have just used their name recognition because he was a widely known, internationally known writer. But it did work to the extent that newspapers picked up the idea. And you can guess who has an interest in making people believe that Thomas Mann, with the aid of Americans, is trying to overthrow South American governments. Their opponents, their antagonists. Also in 1964, an amusing example, amusing now to me with the long historical distance, but maybe not so amusing in 1964. There was a forged letter pretending to be from J. Edgar Hoover, who was then the head of the American FBI, to an employee of his named Thomas Brady. It was circulated, dated April 15th, 1964, and with the intention to prove direct American involvement in the overthrow of Jean Goulard's Brazilian government. Right, so it's, they even forged a previous document that made it seem like there is a Thomas Brady working for the FBI, and then they made a newer document pretending to be J. Edgar Hoover thanking him for his role in South America in political mischief. Now, you might think, why are we supposed to believe that the FBI, which is an internal agency, right? It's for U.S. internal security, is messing with Brazil, for instance? Well, as Bittman writes in his book, it was simply that they wanted to finger the CIA, but they didn't have any recent examples of CIA stationery, but they did know what FBI stationery looks like, so they could forge an FBI letter more easily than a CIA memorandum. So that was simply what they could do, so they did it, and it was picked up by a number of newspapers that I'm listing up here. I don't have to read them to you, but many, many newspapers around South America believed that this forgery was an authentic letter from Hoover to one of his employees thanking them for messing with foreign governments. So as Bittman tells it, the main advantage of these operations by Soviets, by Czech and East German operators was that they could take advantage of the free and open Western press. Right? And that's really their advantage, or the disadvantage of a democratic society in the other direction, like trying to intervene or mess with other countries, since operations would be much less likely to succeed simply because behind the Iron Curtain, all radio stations and TV stations and papers were state-controlled, far less likely to be infiltrated, far less likely to fall for something that was a piece of fake news. So Bittman argues that in democracies, a free and open press plays the essential role in the interplay of political parties and public debates, creating a sphere where people can find a multiplicity of ideological viewpoints. And that is the very point of attack for information operations, right? It's sort of both the strength and the weakness of a democracy. And the books that I listed for you, and you don't have to take pictures of the slides. We're going to share the slides afterwards. It's going to be much easier, so that you don't have to take too many notes of such details. They provide numerous examples if you want to read the Bittman books. I don't know if they're translated into Portuguese. They're translated to many languages, but they're translated into English. Written in English and translated into a number of other languages. And they provide lots of examples of how the Soviet and Czech and East German spy services were able to place false stories in the West using forged documents or bribed witnesses, sometimes blackmail, and other covert operations. There's some notorious examples that were very successful, sometimes in bringing down a politician, sometimes just in embarrassing a political party or a corporation, sometimes in making it look like somebody was privately holding beliefs that they were not supposed to be holding or had not admitted to. So when you look at the German texts, I'll give you a few stories. German spy Heinz Felfe, which is again an autobiographical account, covers a transformation of the Organisation Gehlen into the BND, the West German Secret Intelligence Service in the 50s. Organisation Gehlen is the name that people give to Nazi spies who had been working during the Second World War to collect information against all the enemies of the German Reich, General Gehlen saw that there was going to be an end to the war, and he basically offered his services and all the information he had about the Russians to the Americans in return for being allowed to run his shop after the war. And the Americans found that was a fair deal. They're going to keep this Nazi general in charge of a spy apparatus that they control, because in return they get a lot of information about the Russians. And Felfe undermined that new German agencies by spying for East Germany, for the split other side of Germany, and therefore by implication for their Russians. And just like Bittman, after he was caught, he was discovered. Bittman was not arrested, but they both turned into professors, teaching others about their experiences. He was exchanged on February 14th, 1968, for some other spies in one of those famous scenarios across the bridge. I'm pausing because my monitors have gone blank, but I can read behind me. So what Felfe reports on, in the 50s and 60s, he was able to use information operations to plant false stories, especially with left-leaning daily and weekly newspapers in West Germany, that would undermine the consensus, the political consensus in West Germany and make them think things about East Germany that he wanted them to think, or about Russians that he wanted them to think. And in some cases, they were collaborating with journalists who were sympathetic to that, because as you can imagine, in a split country, there's going to be a lot of ambivalence. But in some cases, they were simply placing forgeries or lies. And in the third German book, co-written by two former officers of the Stasi, they write as former East German agents who helped cook up quite a long series of political scandals in West Germany that undermined both politicians and military figures. I don't expect you to know any of these names. I'm just going to tell you that some of these politicians and generals lost their positions, and some of them lost their lives directly as a result of these information ops. Kiesling committed suicide under very mysterious circumstances. Geisler, Bauschel lost their offices. Brandt and Strauss were disgraced. And these are people not necessarily only on the right end of the spectrum. Brandt is a left-leaning prime minister, and equal opportunity offenders. They weren't only attacking people on the conservative end of German politics, but most of these names are conservative politicians or generals. So their book reports actually lectures to Stasi recruits that are very much a mirror image of what I gave you as a quote from the fictional lecture in the Le Carré book that he made to his, this fictional spy, made a speech to spy recruits, including where they report from memory a speech by Rolf Wagenbreth, who was in fact charged by his boss, the boss of the Stasi, with starting an entire division of that notorious agency that was devoted just to active measures. So after 30 years in that effort, these two came to the conclusion that it was no longer the right kind of tradecraft to place a secretary into the front office of an important target to undermine them when there's a computer in the basement of that office. So they saw that already in the late 80s, early 90s, there was going to be a change in approach. There wasn't going to be as much of a person-focused approach. It was going to be much more of a network-centered approach. And of course, today, when we talk about the internet age, we talk about information operations as a network attack, not as an individual attack. So the Russian phrase, aktivnaya meropriatia, really encompasses something much more than propaganda or fake news. It's not just summarizing open source intelligence or confidential information gathered from the other side. It's the application of ideas, destabilizing ideas, that attack institutions on the other side. And this has a long tradition in Russia. Even the first Soviet Secret Service, the Cheka, already had a department for this, and they've improved their know-how over the generations. You could argue that one reason that the Cold War took a turn in the late 80s is that the very talented and successful East German and Czech spy agencies started assuming, naturally, that the other side is doing the same. Right? If you're doing this for decades, clearly in the Cold War, with the balance of terror on each side, you have to believe that the other side is doing the same. So very soon they were involved in trying to prove that the civil rights movement in their own country, or the peace movements in their own countries, which were actually usually motivated through religion, were in fact remote controlled by the CIA only to undermine the dictatorship of the proletariat. I am pretty confident that the CIA only wished they could be that successful, because they weren't very effective at undermining those kinds of societies or helping those kinds of movements. But Now, of course, there's no country that does not engage in something like that, and some of the more notorious operations may still come from the Russians, but that doesn't mean that other countries like the United States don't engage in that. We know that as of 2002, when Donald Rumsfeld was U.S. Defense Secretary, he started an Office of Strategic Influence in the Pentagon that would engage in Soviet-style active measures against other countries. And we also know that in 2003, then U.S. President Bush announced a new White House agency, the Office of Global Communications, which in turn engaged a public relations agency, the Rendon Group, combining public relations of the traditional sort with active measures of the black sort, of the dark sort. An example is a claim that Saddam Hussein supposedly threw weapons inspectors out of Iraq in 1998. It's not true. You could easily find that out. The inspector, Richard Butler, had decided to withdraw. But who cares about facts when you can spin, right? British historian Frances Stoner Saunders, in her book Who Paid the Piper and several other publications, documents the covert funding by the CIA of European cultural agencies, West European cultural agencies in France, in Germany, in Britain, in Italy, in Austria, to propagate the idea that Western Europe had the greatest cultural freedom, and that therefore they were superior, more successful than East European countries, and that just relying on that apparently benevolent activity to show that East Germany or Czechoslovakia or whatever could not keep up, and that there was therefore a superior system. So we can summarize before taking a break for questions, and then a smoke or a coffee or whatever. Disinformation is not just lying or propaganda or intellectual cheating. It's fabrication of fake news, of course, it's censorship or suppression of important news, but in ever more refined ways, it actually is making opponents believe that all of this information comes from their own side, not from you. Right? So that's the main trick, it's disinformation that seems to come, just as in the last US election, it seems to come not from Russia or North Korea or whoever the imagined or real enemies of the United States are, but it comes out of the American society. Right? It erupts as dissensus in democracy and undermines democracy in its insides. One of the most successful global operations of that sort was to spread the rumor that HIV/AIDS was in fact a militarized virus engineered in a lab in Fort Detrick in 1977, and then used either on purpose or by accident against certain populations. This is not true. Nobody can prove that it is true. But people eventually were able to prove just enough that this rumor was being spread by Russia, to the point that Gorbachev actually officially apologized to the United States many years later for that information or disinformation campaign. And not surprisingly, we see a lot of conspiracy theories about the coronavirus and the illness that it causes, COVID-19, today. Even some of my neighbors and friends have emailed me with some hair-raising ideas about how this was engineered and deployed on purpose and then got out of hand accidentally, etc. So that's the nature of conspiracy theories, and it's not likely that somebody has placed that story, but with my neighbor, I mean. But they love it when something like that seems to come out of the population that is being targeted rather than seen as coming from abroad. And of course now the big problem that we have in confronting this as one of the major trends on the internet is that soon after US President Trump, for instance, was elected, but he's not the only head of state doing this, the New York Times, as one of the most important newspapers in the US, blamed social media and the liars and con artists who hijack media platforms with fake news. And very quickly, Trump and other politicians turned around and blamed the media for being the enemy of the people. You see echoes of this in Hungarian, in Italian, in Polish, and even in English politics. I don't know, which country am I in here? Who is in charge of the state here? You know, that would never happen here, right? That could not happen, surely, in other parts of the world. So it's a point where I see us accelerating the story of disinformation or of information ops and active measures. And so I'm going to try to take a breath before we go into the contemporary scene and maybe even a discussion of the country I'm currently visiting, and where I'm relying on you to raise one or both arms to tell me something about this, and maybe even think about, from your perspective as students of communication, what could be done, what should be done on a local, maybe even on a global scale to address active measures, to at least try to identify where disinformation comes from if we can't stop its spread. But let's take a breath here. If there are any questions right now, I'm happy to take them in here or outside while you catch your nicotine or caffeine or whatever else. Oxygen, perhaps, too. Just remember that in these times of the coronavirus, we want social distancing. So you have to yell at me from 6 feet away. Thank you. Okay. If we're all back, I look forward to hearing from you questions or comments about active measures, objections, complaints. I don't work here, remember? You can say whatever you want. I don't even give you a grade. I don't take attendance either. Anyone? Sir? It's better with a microphone, yeah.
Bem, tu consegue...
Oh, I see. I will join you.
Sorry.
I'm on.
Também. Bom, Peter, você deu um panorama histórico interessante para a nossa discussão, e eu, na verdade, o que eu tenho é uma pergunta bem, não é necessariamente técnica sobre o conteúdo, assim, mas pensando que, diante desses exemplos históricos de estratégia de desinformação e, efetivamente, construção de um aparato, de todo um aparato para esse tipo de medida, me parece cada vez mais difícil imaginar contra-exemplos ou tentativas estratégicas ou contra-táticas para se elaborar isso, que não levem em conta também a construção de contra-aparatos, de algo que seja feito, alguma forma de, não sei, design de alguma coisa que possa efetivamente ter um efeito efetivo diante desse tipo de ação. Então, eu não sei se teria algum contra-exemplo, alguma coisa desse tipo do que já tenha sido desenvolvido historicamente, embora acredito que agora você vai falar mais da situação contemporânea e a gente tem que considerar essa relação dos artefatos que a gente tem à disposição, etc., evidentemente. Então é mais uma dúvida assim, genuína nesse sentido.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for the reverse translation. Some of this I'm going to get to in the second part. Of course, I'm going to get to more recent discussion. Feedback. Am I on here? Yeah. But you're right that these historical examples make one wonder not just about countermeasures and to what extent they're possible or effective, but about counter examples as well. But maybe I'm going to collect some more questions or comments and then try to answer them as I go into the next few slides instead of right now, if that makes sense. But it's good that you brought that up. Thank you. Any other concerns or questions, or you want me to go more in a particular direction? She doesn't hear you.
Continuando um pouco o que o Edu comentou de contramedida, a gente estava conversando sobre como essas ações elas acabam se tomando uma proporção de computador, de ser exponencial, de acelerar cada vez mais. E a gente ficou pensando, a gente acabou conversando sobre como a gente poderia agir também e se colocar diante dessa situação, uma vez que a gente não tem um alcance de computador, uma capacidade de leitura e de filtragem da desinformação, enfim, em proporções computacionais. E também isso remeteu um pouco ao que tu falou ontem sobre se a gente quando a gente tem os computadores envolvidos nos processos, parece que a gente está diante de caixas pretas, que a gente não consegue ver a ação do computador. A gente aperta aqui um botão, sai um resultado, mas a gente não vê o que aconteceu. Então, se a gente transferisse também essa responsabilidade de leitura de desinformação para pensar as ações para um computador, da mesma forma, talvez a gente não tivesse noção de como isso está sendo processado. Não é tanto também uma pergunta, é mais uma conversa que a gente desenvolveu agora no intervalo e se relaciona com o que o Edu colocou, assim, que adiciona o problema da exponencialidade, né?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a very important aspect of it. What I don't go into slides in a moment, but I promise I will get to some of the questions that Eduardo has raised. But what you're mentioning, the possible role that either a media operator or a government agency could play in stopping at least the spread, if not the original insertion of an information operation. The only way that is currently handled is that Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, maybe TikTok, maybe other operators, I don't know about TikTok because that's really owned by a Chinese company and they don't feel as obliged to operate that way. But some of these networks have been employing indirectly, not as their own employees, but through gig work. I don't know if that's a thing here in Brazil too, but they will hire on a minimal hourly basis people whose job is going to be to go through everything that's posted and to filter, to make a decision on whether to say, okay, that can stay up, or no, that has to be taken down, or that has to be referred to a supervisor who will have that discussion with others on whether or not this is permissible speech, right? Now, different countries have different approaches to this, but to my knowledge, there is no country outside of authoritarian regimes like China, Russia, that take a governmental approach where the government does the filtering, the censoring, the suppressing, depending on what side of the coin you're on. To some people, it's good filtering, and to other people, it's censorship. So governments are hesitating to take that role in a democratic sense, so in a situation. And in a democracy, mostly we point to corporate remedies, whereas in authoritarian politics, you're not going to invoke the corporate response, you're going to invoke a government response. And then, again, on the government side, and I will discuss this a little bit in a moment, you can distinguish between different governmental approaches that are available. And I'm going to even borrow the work of one of my heroes, Bruce Schneier, in discussing different kinds of political setups and what different options you have depending on what kind of political situation you have domestically. But as I said yesterday, and as we all know, these media companies operating on the internet are not national, they're multinational, they're global. So they have to deal both with their global stature and the differences between national laws. So that causes a difficulty for, let's have some sympathy, maybe even for Google and Facebook. No, I'm kidding. But if you're working for them, they're in a hard situation of knowing how to apply local laws in an international context. And they have run into difficulty with their own full-time employees who disagree sometimes with their management on how this is handled, right? For instance, when Google agrees to filter certain things in China that it would not filter in Brazil or in the United States, when Facebook agrees to make certain deals with India, which is cracking down pretty hard on internet freedoms for certain populations. I'll talk about that not today, but next week. So corporations are trying, we could stipulate that corporations are trying to do the right thing, but are not always sure what the right thing is. And governments have to deal not only with their local populations and their motivations or preferences, but also deal with their counterparts who are multinational actors. So the most extreme and most explicit confrontation of corporate versus governmental responses to these kinds of problems, I think you see in the European Union, because there the political body is also a multinational one, and they've been able to fine or push back against certain corporations, and they've been able to pass laws that are much more explicit than anything you have in the United States or elsewhere around the globe. So I'm going to end with a project. This is going to be my last slide, and I'll give you a very quick preview, making me skip several points. I'm going to end with a project that the European Union has. It's called EU versus Disinfo. And the last slide is going to show you their homepage. And I was very tempted. I'm a subscriber to their feed on social media and email lists and so on. I was very tempted to simply illustrate another 20 or 30 slides from their project. But instead, I'm just going to give you the one slide that shows you their homepage, and you can look this up yourself, and you can go into the history of their trying to pull the teeth of disinformation that is making the European Union have a hard time. They're not always fingering the who, because that's difficult, but they're pretty good at identifying where these things originally come from, or at least identifying that these Twitter accounts that are multiplying the fake news are bots, they're not real people, proving that they're not because they all have his face or mine, or they all have just been started in the last 2 days and have done nothing but amplify this particular item of fake news. So they're both technically proficient and politically savvy. There's nothing like that in the United States that I'm aware of that coordinates the response of different states. There's currently not the motivation on the federal level in the United States to have a coordinated response. California, for that reason, has tried to roll its own solution, which just went into effect on January 20th. A legislation that would protect individuals a little bit more online and would allow them to be a little less exploited by marketers and a little bit less targeted, or micro-targeted it's called, by information operations or fake news. This is particularly important in an election year, which is the case in the United States, but any other democracy is facing that, not just in election years, but in any given day. But in election years, people are more motivated, politicians are more motivated to pay attention to that on the governmental side. And that, interestingly, also has led to some politicians, at least in the US, to suggest certain things that they would impose on corporations. Right? If corporations are not going to be self-censoring or self-regulating, then they have to be regulated by politics. But currently, I don't see a perfect scenario anywhere, either of the corporate or of the governmental response. But I will try to show you some of the things that one could think through, and then maybe you will tell me something more about the Brazilian situation or the Brazilian view as well. But there was another hand back there, another question?
Oi. Sobre fake news e a plataformização da comunicação, eu acompanho um podcast chamado Tecnocracia, em que ele fala principalmente quando o YouTube bota como meta o tempo de visualização dos vídeos extremistas se tornaram muito mais visualizados, eles propagam isso, mesmo as pessoas denunciando, eles dizem que não pode fazer nada em troca de uma liberdade de expressão, porque de fato ele não atacava diretamente um profissional. Eu até compartilho contigo o link, é em português, mas ele é muito bom. E aí, então, tu tem todo um cenário de uma plataforma que, em prol dos lucros, deseja que as pessoas fiquem presas e elas negam o conteúdo que está sendo veiculado. Então, tu tem movimento antivacina, terraplanismo e ataques de um alt-right, um novo alt-right, né, remodelado, um fascismo remodelado. Mas, contra a fake news, eu achei muito interessante num evento de programação sobre o web livre, que eu sou mega fã disso, que é um caso quando o Donald Trump foi eleito. Ele atacou, se eu não me engano, a Fox News, dizendo que eles eram mentirosos. E a CNN, isso. Isso. Ele atacou a CNN e a Fox News foi lá e disse, olha só, a gente tem uma visão diferente deles, mas o que determinado canal fala é verídico. E isso, nesse evento que eu fui de programação, eles estavam falando de quase que um cross-check entre jornalistas de diferentes visões, em que eles pegassem uma mesma notícia e um desse respaldo para o outro, quase que fosse uma cadeia de blockchain. Então, estávamos no evento de programação e eles estavam basicamente estruturando uma ideia de blockchain para uma fake news. E agora, com o coronavírus, eu vi uma notícia no Update or Die, né, um blog brasileiro, que os fact-checkers ao redor do mundo se uniram, pegando cada fato falso de cada país, concentrando ali para elucidar contra as teorias da conspiração ao redor do mundo, né? Até para evitar que uma fake news de outro país venha para cá remodelada, repaginada. E isso tudo iniciativas, entre aspas, orgânicas, né? Entre pessoas que talvez não teriam o alcance de uma plataforma. não endeusando ou não botando o Google como alguém benevolente, porque tem seus interesses. Se tu jogar coronavírus nele, ele bota um alerta de um SOS e também ele tenta trazer informações jamais olhando para esse cenário específico, mas é um pequeno movimento. Então, assim, o que nós, meros mortais, poderíamos fazer, né? Eu acho que o fact-check e o cross-check, assim, eu poder validar uma pessoa, mesmo que ela tenha uma visão diferente da minha, em um cenário, primeiro, contra toda essa plataformização e extremismo que é tão propagado pelas redes. Então, e Bruce Schneider, eu tenho o livro Data em Golias dele, excelente, muito bom. Era isso.
Obrigado. So, I want to be careful to distinguish. I think you were talking about two different things. Like on the one hand, and I will come back to that in a few slides, you're talking about information literacy and being able to be critical and wise and not easily misled or you know, falling for fake news. And certainly that is one important task of education in general, of this kind of program in particular, learning about new media, about communication, about the effective or not so effective use of different channels, and about the ethically and morally appropriate use of those channels. But what you were talking about with Fox News versus CNN or New York Times versus other papers, that's not even the level that I'm talking about. Yes, you know, most democracies will have TV channels, newspapers, websites that are devoted to a particular ideological camp, a faction in that society, and that's fine. We all understand that, and we are going to be comfortable. And supposedly in Porto Alegre, there's even an ideological differentiation between being a fan of Gremio and a fan of Inter, etc. We all understand that there are allegiances, and you're comfortable with your own area and less comfortable with other parts of that ideological spectrum. But that's par for the course. That's actually a strength of a democratic society. As the Le Carré quote says, you know, we celebrate diversity and difference, and we love that democracy is about having a debate. That's not yet fake news. So even though I'm not a Fox News watcher, I know some, and they tend to be pretty exclusive, right? I'm also not a New York Times reader because I find them rather upper middle class, boring liberal hysterics. But we can sort of make these cartoon identifications of you were like this and you were like that. But it's fine as long as we all believe in the viability of our own political system. Information operations are insidious because they will go, for instance, not as RT, right? Russia Today is a very overt propaganda arm of Russia. RT operates, do they operate in Brazil? As a website or as a TV show? They have a pretty big presence in the United States as an English language television channel and website for news, but it's very heavily Russia influenced. Right? It's owned and operated by the Russian state. It's called RT. Now that's not necessarily already fake news. It's just ideologically colored news. In the same way, I think, I'm hoping I'm not offending anybody, in the same way in which a right-wing channel like Fox News is overtly, not covertly, it's very overtly ideologically motivated news. Right? Now, I don't like either, but somebody who's comfortable with that is going to be pretty much an exclusive consumer of Fox or RT, of New York Times, or whatever it is. Right? The success or the problematic success of information ops of active measures is when somebody manages to infiltrate, for instance, the New York Times or Fox News, CNN, or RT, and address the people who trust that channel and basically infect them with something that makes them distrust, that makes them doubt that institution, that makes them lose their conviction in such a way as to sow discord, in such a way that it seems to come not from outside, not from North Korea or Russia or any imagined or real enemies of a free society, but from within, right? So that's why I want to be careful to make that clear. This is not just about one ideological camp fighting with all means another ideological camp. This is about making it seem like the disagreement comes from among yourselves, right? Through forgery or blackmail or through infiltration of something that is a trusted institution. Now, these are maybe not the most important institutions that I want to protect. I think democracy has some other more important institutions that it wants to protect. The courts of law, the media in general, and education. And you can see in populist attacks on them using fake news and you know, not the rhetoric of fake news, which is defensive of the populist Bolsonaro, Trump type politician, but actual infiltration of them to make people lose faith in justice, in education, and in the media. And to actually believe that the media are the enemy of the people, collectively, that all journalists are enemies of the people, and collectively that all lawyers are corrupt, collectively that all institutions of higher education are just fraud and waste and abuse, right? That's the insidious making you feel that you can no longer trust the institutions that uphold a democratic state. So he seems to agree, although that's a pretty dire and shocking preview of the next few slides. So what I'm trying to get to is that now that the dominant media formats, whether it's text or image, or sound or audiovisual, and you were talking about that, are mostly going to be on the internet, right? What we call a newspaper may be called a newspaper, but it doesn't come to you on paper. It's most likely coming to you on a screen, small or large screen. The question is exactly how to regulate and govern the net so as to avoid not just fake news, hate speech, but disinformation of that sort that seems to come from your side, even though it's been planted by another side, right? Something that seems to come from outside the Brazilian people, but may actually be a manipulation of Brazil by somebody outside Brazil. Surely we can agree, among all our ideological disagreements in Brazil or in any other country, we can agree that the only people who should play that game of disagreement about Brazil are the Brazilians. And the only people who should play the game of disagreement about the European Union are Europeans. And that should not be remotely poisoned by somebody in Russia or wherever else, right? I think that's a pretty easy thing to agree to. That, you know, it should be governed by the people, not by somebody outside. So here, as I was saying, most countries face a choice between something like a Chinese-style authoritarian legislation that invokes national security and defense against extremism, or what you see sometimes in Europe, a rights-oriented legislation that does not necessarily increase corporate or state powers, but that tries to strengthen the individual and in relation to corporations and governments. Those are two trends that we can see in the last few years. So when we deal with online disinformation, whether it's computational propaganda or smaller scale, in the use of algorithms, of automation, and of human creation to distribute misleading information over social media networks and other networks to manipulate public opinion, it depends both on technology itself and on human agency. Right? It's not enough to put those monitors into Facebook or Twitter and have them decide. They're overwhelmed. And there's some really, really terrible stories. There's some of them have taken those jobs intentionally in order to write about them afterwards. So they're overqualified, but they were hired to do those, by the hour terrible jobs of filtering posts on YouTube, on Facebook, on Twitter, and then they wrote about them recently. And they suffer. There's a very traumatizing thing to do for several hours every day. You see horrible things, you hear horrible things, and you have to decide whether that horrible thing is allowed to stay online or whether you should recommend that it be taken off. Often, by the time you make that decision, it's already been copied and propagated and retweeted and reposted in such a way that you can't delete it completely. So you feel impotent, you feel weak, you feel useless, even though you paid next to nothing in order to see horrible things all day long, and your role doesn't seem to make that much of a difference. So that does not seem to be the best answer. But so far, that's the only corporate response. So we see manipulations of public opinion in many different corners, like whether or not to vaccinate children against well-known diseases. That should not be a contentious topic at all. Right? It should not be a question. I don't know if that's a thing in Brazil, but in the United States, a country that can well afford to vaccinate against the most dangerous things for children, there's an increasing movement of people who believe that they should not, because vaccination is a conspiracy of the state, and vaccines, instead of keeping your child healthy, is going to make your child autistic, and other nonsense that has been planted, apparently coming from well-meaning other parents, but it's been planted just to undermine trust in public authority, undermine trust in science, undermine trust in medicine, undermine trust in the institutions that are supposed to protect people and protect the whole population. This is not just about individuals. It's not just my kid that has to be protected. If there's only one child in the preschool or kindergarten or primary school that belongs to a family that does not believe, the risk for the whole community has gone up. So this is pretty damaging, right? And vaccination is just one very wacky and weird example, but you can imagine many other examples that are calculated to undermine the trust of a particular community in its own institutions. And the most extreme example, perhaps, the most dangerous example, perhaps, that we can come up with is who to vote for in elections. And I personally know people who are, and this comes back to your point about information literacy and how to tell right from wrong in social media. I personally know people who are highly educated, fully employed academics who have fallen victim to the most nonsensical propaganda and fake news, and who are no longer my friends because I just can't. I mean, they're just as trained as any of us to discern whether this is bullshit. Whether this is verifiable or falsifiable, and they just don't. Any of us is vulnerable to this because it's become so micro-targeted and so insidious. And as long as you trust, and you have to trust. If you can't trust people in your social media circle, these are your friends. These are your family members. If you can't trust them, you can't trust anyone. Right? So you have to assume that people are going to trust that inner circle or that second inner circle of friends and family. If you can infiltrate that, you can undermine pretty much everything. So the absence, as I was saying in response to her question here, the absence of human editors in social media newsfeed is only one problem that makes it easy for political actors to manipulate social networks. And they go from being an infrastructure for coordinating all sorts of good things like civic engagement to a computational tool for social control. Which is one thing that, frankly, Google and Twitter and Facebook, etc., like. Right? Of course, it gives them a lot of power, which is one thing why, one reason why politicians don't want to necessarily antagonize the operators of those social networks, because they need them. You cannot win an election without any social media support. You just can't. Just like a generation ago, you could not win an election without some newspaper supporting you or some television journalist supporting you. You need the amplification, the propagation of good news about you. Now that we've discovered that there's not just the propagation of a positive image, but there's also a lot of channels for the propagation of things that undermine our faith, we don't know how to separate those two uses of the same channels. So I have a colleague in Irvine, at the University of California, Irvine, who is a law professor, but he's also currently the UN Special Rapporteur for the promotion and protection of the right to freedom of opinion and expression, which is a long title to have. So I just call him a law professor. But his role is to defend free speech around the globe on behalf of the United Nations. And together with the African Commission for Human Rights and the Center for Law and Democracy, they issued together a joint declaration on fake news, disinformation, and propaganda. You can find it online if you want to look. It recognizes the concern that online disinformation misleads entire populations, drowns out verifiable information, and makes it harder for everyone to distinguish fact from fiction. The problem is, as I said just before the break, by the time that declaration came out in typical bureaucratically delayed fashion from a large multinational agency, Trump and other politicians like him had already co-opted the phrase fake news against critical media and called them enemies of the people. So the very first place where you would look to filter critically fake news from real news is now suspect, is now attacked by the people who are supposed to be criticized by the media, right? So it's a pretty admirable move, if you will, pretty amazing sleight of hand, almost Orwellian change of the phrase into something that pulls the teeth of the media that are supposed to be critically holding politicians to account. And that was the legacy of the 2016 election, 2018 result, 2017 declaration by the UN. In the current year, in 2020, the Trump campaign to re-elect him president, regardless whether it had help from Russia or not, is about to spend $1 billion, $1 billion, on what could be the most extensive disinformation campaign in United States history, in American history, borrowing tactics from demagogues and dictators abroad. So we now in the United States face the prospect of an election, and any other country with similar types of politician could. Elections shaped by coordinated bot attacks, fake local news sites, micro-targeted fear-mongering, and anonymous mass texting. I'm going to come back to that another day as well when I talk about what happened to the weaponization of memes. We used to love memes. People who celebrate and study internet culture, we used to think that memes are kind of like the cute corner of the internet with lolcats and things like that. But it's become a dangerous aspect of the internet as well. Now, it's not just the Trump campaign. I don't want to be one-sided here. Both U.S. big parties have access to such tools, and certainly there are some accusations against people who ran on the Democratic side. Mostly those people have bowed out of the race by now, but there are still 3 candidates in the race. They will use whatever tool they see appropriate, and certainly the Democratic Party has been heavily using social media as well. But the particular problem in the case of somebody like Trump is that this is a president who lies constantly, who traffics in conspiracy theories, and retweets other very well-known conspiracy theory artists, and manipulates the government for his own gain. So in this particular case, maybe even worse than Orban or other politicians around the globe, there's potential for havoc and spending $1 billion, it's an enormous amount of money to manipulate the apparatus of public opinion. Potential for havoc is enormous. So here comes the theory that I'm borrowing from Bruce Schneier, and I think we've agreed to send out a reading later on that will allow you to follow that up in some more detail. He co-wrote with a law professor an article that describes democracy as basically an information system. Democracy is an information system. You know, to the extent that we can describe democracy's functioning, it has a lot to do with information. And they describe it as relying on 2 kinds of knowledge. And then they can, with that distinction, they can describe why disinformation is such a particularly successful attack against democracy, and why disinformation is less effective against autocratic regimes. Which is why I think I got away with telling you earlier that the best disinformation in historical examples are from autocratic countries attacking democratic countries. It's simply that democracy is more vulnerable. And here's why. Right? So they distinguish between 2 types of knowledge in a democratic society. Common knowledge, the body of information that people in a society broadly agree upon, even if they don't always like it. Right? So let's take any kind of Western-style democracy. Mostly you see people agreeing that they understand how their government works. Right? How do politicians become politicians? How do they get in office? How my vote makes a difference in that? How often I get to vote on those politicians, and what kinds of roles those politicians will have, etc. That's common knowledge. Contested knowledge, the things that we not just don't like sometimes, but really fundamentally disagree about in a society, could be the role of the government in the economy. Right? Yes, I agree that every 4 years, every 2 years, every 6 years, every 8 years, I send somebody up there to tell, but I disagree on what they should be doing in that office to influence, let's say, the economy, or how big the government role or small the government's role should be in running the country, or what the tax rate should be, higher or lower, or what regulations should be, should there be more or fewer, are they going to be harmful or useful, etc. That's contested knowledge. Right? That's an ideological battleground, but within a democracy where we agree that the best solution to those problems is to see what everybody believes and send their representatives to government and have them debate. Right? So in other words, democracies draw fundamentally on disagreements to solve their problems, but to do so, they need to agree on the rules for having those disagreements take place and shape a debate, and maybe take turns in forming coalitions or forming governments, etc. Are you with me so far? Is there anybody who thinks we mostly think that's okay? That's a fair description of how democracies look from the inside or the outside? Now, I don't know if there's anybody who has a lot of personal experience with an autocratic regime, but the thing seems to be that an autocratic government does not rely on common knowledge about process to maintain a monopoly. They often suppress common knowledge. There's much less transparency about who are these people who are ruling China, how do they rise to power, Who are these people who rule Russia? It seems today I saw a news item that says Putin will be president forever, although he's already run out of term limits twice, right? So they have some elections, but no Russian believes that their vote is going to make a change to what Putin was going to do, right? They may support or not support that, but no Russian believes that that's an open question, right? That's manipulated elsewhere. So go to the Arab Spring, something that people always point to in terms of the internet having an influence on national politics. The Tunisian government had control over common knowledge, right? It required everybody publicly to support the regime, but they forgot to pay attention to Facebook. So Facebook and Twitter played a big role in propagating all kinds of protests and doubts across the Arab peninsula. And what we call the Arab Spring brought a lot more rights, not just to women in those countries, but to every individual voter, and opened those countries up for a while. So this is why Russia, for instance, to pick one example country, really sees an open internet as a threat to its regime. And China is the same thing, right? If you have an autocratic, centrally dominated government, any kind of open internet or open media society in general is going to be a threat to that monopoly on power. They don't require common knowledge about process. Democracies, therefore, are vulnerable to attack that turn common political knowledge, these are our institutions, into contested knowledge, right? So now you can say, no, these election results, they're not reliable. I believe that election was manipulated. I believe that election was stolen. I believe that election was illegitimate. I believe that you have to re-vote, etc. Right? Even a country that is ostensibly a democracy like Italy has suffered through multiple post-World War II crises of that sort, where people say, yes, we go through the motions of electing, and then the losers do not accept the results. A similar example is census results, which are politically meaningful, because if you know how many people are in voting age in a particular area, that will tell you what the political results might be. There too, there's been a lot of doubt sown, and you can attack a democracy very effectively, either by telling them the census is really not a census, it's not just about counting you as a tax base, it's about drafting you into military, or it's about forcing you to vaccinate, or it's about whatever conspiracy nonsense you want to throw into the mix, so that people will hide from the census, especially vulnerable parts of the population. I'm thinking in the United States about people of color, but I don't know if that's happening in Brazil as well, where there's a disadvantaged part of the population that is perhaps manipulated indirectly or directly into withdrawing from the census, which therefore takes their political power away, because now they're not in the census, which means they can't put their weight into the scales when it comes to voting or other processes. You see what I mean? So democracies are more vulnerable to this precisely because they're supposed to have institutions that defend them against these things, that hold a common political knowledge up against the ups and downs of contested knowledge. And we can see this all around the world. You could pull up Foreign Affairs, which is a magazine that covers international affairs and shows you various stories about how technology around the world can strengthen autocracy. I don't even know how to say that in English, let alone in Portuguese, but I'm sure you know what that headline means. It used to be that we thought the internet in the late 60s, early 70s was founded by and run by, of course, originally the U.S. government, but fostered this kind of hippie internationalism, pacifism. Everybody will understand everybody better. Everybody will be able to communicate with people like them. Gay people or queer people will be able to find other gay and queer people even if they're not in their own neighborhood. It will be less isolated. Disabled people, anybody disadvantaged can be on the internet and therefore overcome the limitations of their geography or of their race or of their gender or of their sexual orientation, whatever it might be. We used to have this idealism about the internet being something that brings a lot of good things to humanity. It turns out that it can also be weaponized in the opposite direction, that it can be a suppressive, that it can be a censorious, that it can be an authoritarian power, and that has been put into action around the world. India is one example, but there are many other countries. Here on the left, I have a quick graph from a report that shows that more and more countries are resorting to cutting people off from the global web, often to quell protests and silence critics. Right? This has gone down from 2016 to 17, but only gone up since then. More than 30 countries around the globe have actually shut down internet access inside their borders during the year 2019 in order to stop a protest or to silence their critics, in order to stop the propagation of real news that they call fake news. Right? So that's why the governmental response is also problematic. Right? It's not always easy, and that's why one of my next lectures has to talk about human rights. It's not always easy to tell the difference between benevolent, helpful filtering of fake news and censorship or suppression of criticism. Right? India has used the practice much more than any other country. If you look under the hood of those reports by year, you see that India more than 100 times, in the year 2019, shut down internet in parts of its country. In that case, you might know from reading the news, it's mostly because of the citizenship law introduced that disadvantages the Islamic population in parts of their country, in Kashmir and elsewhere. But there are a number of countries around the world that have resorted to that. Myanmar is another example. Iran is another example. Malaysia is another example. So it's not always disclosed, right? It's hard to tell. It's not like a light goes off and you can tell from afar, like, oh, they've turned something off. It just, sometimes only a day or a few hours. Shutdowns are usually not disclosed, but there are some internet monitoring groups that can rely on diagnostic tools that measure changes in network activity. There's Access Now, and these slides all come from Access Now, is one of those groups, and there's also a company in the United Kingdom called NetBlocks, and they track dips in network data and then call attention to disruption, such as in Venezuela when there were protests. And many people can at least suspect, if not prove, that both the United States and Russia have had a hand in the disputes within Venezuela. So they're dealing with a multi-front confrontation where one foreign operator wants to replace the government and the other one wants to support the current government. Neither of them much care about what the actual citizens of Venezuela might want, it seems. So in order to not hear from them, we're going to just turn off the internet. And in Iran, it's a very authoritarian situation as well. After Iran ordered the shutdown in November 2019, there was a research lab in California called the Center for Applied Internet Data Analysis that ran tests measuring the connectivity in Iran and produced a detailed sequence of a week-long blackout, including how devices were severed from the internet, although users could visit local Iranian websites, which are largely government-controlled. Right? So if you're speaking on behalf of that government, you believe that this is protecting Iran against foreign influence, that may be the case, or it may be a case of censorship of the people by their own government, by their authoritarian rulers. And it's not just governments that have been doing this. There are also companies that have emerged as players in these across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. They disclose very little about how they handle government orders or when and why they turn the internet off, and they don't usually respond to comments. They're not accountable to anybody outside their own government. And if their own government is the one telling them to do this, why would they tell another non-governmental or governmental agency about this? So the question really is, what can be done? If the same fake nukes techniques that benefit autocracies by making everyone unsure about political alternatives will undermine democracies by making people question the common institutions that bind their society, what can be done? What should be done? You know, what is the approach that we in academia or in communications, in digital culture, or we just as simple citizens can attempt? With Bruce Schneier, we could argue that democracies need to defend the common knowledge that they need to function, which means to bolster confidence in the institutions that maintain that common knowledge. That means defend the legitimacy of parliament, of universities, of education, of the courts, and of media, whether it's papers or TV or other journalists. Defend their credibility and make them the critical institutions that they have to be in order to defend that society against enemies outside and enemies within. It means that democracies need to make it much harder for political groups outside those countries to coordinate with inside political groups for information operations through measures like transparencies in political funding and in political spending. Right? So in the American case that I know better because I live in the United States most of the time, it's not enough to point to Russian or intermediate messing with social media that benefits Donald Trump. That's finger pointing that makes us feel momentarily better and say, it was her, you know, they did that. What does that do? The damage is already done. You need to counter the damage that was done by saying, no, I do support and believe that our courts, our universities, our newspapers are doing the best job that they can, and that they should not be called enemies of the people, that they should not be associated with fraud and waste and abuse, that they are not corrupt, that there are, in fact, the very first and last line of defense of a democratic society against those enemies outside or inside. And remember, the active measures make it seem like those enemies are inside when in fact they're often outside. And that's the insidious and interesting history of active measures that has been sort of the dark side of advertising and propaganda and marketing, and was very selectively used throughout the Cold War, but has become a major activity in the internet age. So here is the EU versus Disinfo website that I recommend. It's the only such project that I've seen over the last 2 years, 3 years, that I've looked at this, actually, yeah, more than 3 years, that I've seen consistently not just call out something as fake news or disinformation, but in analyzing how it spread, who might be behind it, whose interest it actually serves, even though it looks like it's something else, actually fingering accounts that have been helping it, actually helping Twitter or Facebook or YouTube shutting those actors down, maybe banning those profiles, maybe even tracing the internet protocol addresses of the places that are setting up these puppets. I've given a version of this talk before where I showed a clip from a US TV show that goes into a very remarkable mock-up of one of those war rooms. I don't know if you know Alex Jones as a name. Alex Jones is one of the most notorious American conspiracy theorists. I was happy to see he was arrested yesterday for drunk driving. and immediately Twitter was gleeful because they explained it right away to me. He probably believes that alcohol helps him against the coronavirus, so he had to be drunk. It was his civic duty to be drunk driving. Anyway, enough of making fun of conspiracy theorists. The TV show clip I no longer am allowed to show as part of a lecture because I don't have the right to reproduce the show. I don't want to pay for the rights to produce that clip, but it's pretty funny. If you want to email me, I can point you to where that show is. It's pretty incredible. There's some documentaries coming out as well that are more serious portrayals than that fictional one of war rooms set up inside a country but also outside a country, because you can very easily pretend that it's located inside, and pretending that there are local newspapers in your community or that there are local citizens, concerned voters in your community, and infiltrating the legitimate channels that you trust and know, and maybe that even your parents and grandparents have already trusted and known, and planting stories or planting something that looks like a legitimate news item that will undermine your belief in your own institutions and in your own politicians and in your own educational or legal institutions in particular. So EU versus disinfo.eu is a website that has been particularly good about disinformation spread in the Western Balkans and in the Southern European Union. And a lot of it is pro-Kremlin disinformation. If you analyze it, you'll see that it helps Russian interests. If you analyze how they deal with Chechnya, Ukraine, other things that are in the international news. And I think looking at this, even though it's of a region that's very far from here, very far from Brazilian politics, can teach you something about what could help even within a local context, even within a Brazilian political contentious context, where we're always, in all countries around the world, we're dealing with the potential of weaponizing fake news or weaponizing disinformation in any kind of local or national political context and contest. So that's my recommendation, and the last slide for today, as I promised, is sort of a, not perfect, but it's a pretty good example of just documenting who is behind this, or who seems to be behind this, who seems to be benefiting the most from this, how could the spread of this be at least slowed down, how could this be undone, right? So it's not even a defensive operation. The thing that made me feel confident that they're doing a good job is that the Russians say this is not a European operation, it's a CIA front. The moment somebody says that, I believe that that was a hit, right? They hit a nerve in Russia. I am pretty convinced that it's not a CIA front. There are some CIA fronts, I'm sure, in Europe still, but the EU is quite capable of putting up its own websites and hiring its own experts without having to be bankrolled like it is 50s or 60s by American interests. So it's a website with weekly updates, and you can subscribe to them or not, or you can just drill down into one case study and see how this is played out and how it can be analyzed as playing into the hands of certain interests and against the hands of other interests. I don't know of any other examples like this, but I am hoping that we will see other examples like this come up around the world that help citizens with the information literacy that you brought up correctly, that help us not necessarily take. That doesn't mean that everybody has to take the role of journalist or the role of professor or the role of judge, but just help people to understand that when we undermine trust in those institutions, we're actually hurting ourselves. When we believe that they're all corrupt, we're actually hurting ourselves. It may well be that some of our politicians are corrupt, but it doesn't help us to believe that they are by default corrupt. Or you just have to fire them all and elect better politicians, better judges, and get better professors too, because this one is going to shut up now. Thank you. Questions, comments?
Eu não sei se o meu comentário vai fugir um pouco assim da proposta da cadeira, da aula de hoje, mas que foi um pensamento inevitável que eu tive durante a tua fala, porque, claro, a gente debateu toda a questão do excesso de informação, o que é verídico, o que não é, e toda essa enxurrada. E eu queria, e assim, eu tive uma reflexão num caminho um pouco assim oposto de saber diferenciar o que é real, o que não é das informações, mas a gente, pelo menos eu vou partir da minha assim visão pessoal do que eu presencio assim na minha família e da uma posição social um pouco onde a minha família tem uma escolaridade um pouco mais abaixo. A gente acaba tendo que lidar também com a questão de excesso, além do excesso de formação, esse excesso de formação ser tão intimidador, às vezes, para pessoas mais humildes, mais pobres, ou pessoas mais idosas, que isso acaba levando à alienação, acaba levando a não querer mais acesso a essa informação e o conhecimento comum ele acaba sendo tão descreditado que leva a total alienação e não ter mais o interesse em questão política de saúde, social, educação, enfim. E aí eu só queria saber assim meio uma reflexão tua de a partir do momento que a gente conseguir construir barreiras no universo virtual, das informações virtuais, para combater esse nível de informação, saber diferenciar o que seria informação real ou não, como tu acha que isso poderia reduzir o nível de alienação que a gente acaba vendo se tornando meio crescente em algumas áreas sociais?
Thank you. That is a very relevant and big concern. Two aspects actually that you bring up. One is just access to information, and the other is a level of disenfranchisement or disconnection from the institutions of knowledge or education or there seem to be temples of information that are not accessible to everybody the same way. They're intimidating or even worse. So those are two things that you bring up. I'm going to try to get to that in one of the next few talks when I talk about human rights. Not to give everything away already, but there's been a debate over whether or not internet access itself, just access to the internet at all, should be declared a human right. So not just the right of the educated or the right of the well-off or the right of the people who can afford it or the right of people who are born into knowledge or education, but the right of every human, which would be a transformational concept. This is not something that everybody agrees on because the idea of human rights is contentious and the idea of the internet is not uniformly seen as something that is going to help. Right? It's not the solution. Right? It's a technology. It's not a repository of wisdom. It could be just as bad as it is good for you or your family or any of us. But it's a very important aspect of the analysis of internet or digital culture. There's a digital divide. We call it in the United States a digital divide. Even in a rich country like the United States, there are a lot of people who do not have easy access to any information, not even just the internet, but to other information, TV, newspaper news, whatever information. And they feel disenfranchised in multiple ways. Right? It's not just access to education or access to a computer. It's an economic barrier. It can also be a status barrier. They could have it, but they don't have it for other reasons. So the digital divide is very real around the world. And the digital divide now also has, again, two possible solutions. There could be a governmental response. The government could make public libraries have more computers, have more newspapers, have senior citizens' homes or other people who cannot easily go to a public library or to a school have that access in a retirement home or in a hospital, etc. There are many such governmental initiatives. That's one possible response. The government is never completely disinterested. They're only going to do that if it stabilizes the current political situation. So some countries have opted to do that. Some other countries have opted not to do that. The alternative to that is a corporate response. And we see in a lot of Asian countries that there's not been a governmental but a corporate response. Right? The government has invited Facebook, for instance, or other big actors in, and now they can give you the illusion, the idea that there is more broadly access to information, but it's access to what I call a walled garden. It's not the internet. It's it's a small window into something that is very, very carefully curated for them. That's what you get on Chinese mobile devices, on Indian mobile devices, in many parts of Africa where it's unaffordable to have computers in every home. The government could not provide that. A corporation does not provide that. A lot of people rely on their mobile phones. That's not one, but the only way to access what people think is the internet. But they don't really access the internet. They access something that is a corporately controlled window into a very selective part of digital culture. So I hope that when I get to talk to you all about human rights and digital culture, that we can discuss that in more detail because it's a very important facet of it. But the other thing is educational attainment, educational differences. And there, again, there's been some corporate initiatives. We were just talking earlier today about online education in Brazil and elsewhere, which seems to promise an alternative to this type of institution. And I'm very skeptical about it, even though under the sign of the coronavirus, when I go back home, I will be teaching online because nobody wants to sit in a classroom anymore in California. Remember, the better off you are materially, the more paranoid you become. So our students are very paranoid, and our institution has reacted by canceling the current classes and putting the spring quarter only online. That's not, in my opinion, a very effective way of instruction. So whenever you see the idea that we can have a cheap way of accessing education, of attaining education by studying online, I think you should be skeptical. Yes, there are great things that we can do with remote conferencing, with video conferencing. There's a lot of things I can learn from the internet that I can't. You can probably learn a lot more things from the internet than from me. That is true. That is certainly true. But there's still a lot of things to be said in favor of the institutions. That's why I want to defend them. Not just because I'm an old man who works for a big institution of education, but because I really believe that. It's the other way around. I work for that institution because I really do believe that. With all of its faults, the university is one of those institutions that has lasted for more than 1,000 years and has, on balance, I believe, played a positive role. Right? Not every university, but collectively, on balance, universities have played a very positive role in human history. There are some other institutions that have been similarly long-lived, and now I'm going to be in difficult territory here, so I'm going to scan your faces closely for signs of panic or revulsion. But there are some other long-lived institutions that we used to point to in the case of people who are less well-off, who are less well-educated. They used to rely much more on family and on church. And I think we can all see that around the globe, there's a smaller role for the family, the big family, the multi-generational family. We don't live where our grandparents live. People have fewer children in many countries. The grandparents do not provide childcare because they're far away, right? So the large family as an institution does not play the role that it used to, which has consequences for the transmission of knowledge, for the confidence in that institution and in other institutions. I personally learned to read, not in school, but from my grandfather. Right? And this is an aberration in my case. I'm not from the 19th century, although I am old, but I'm not that old. But that used to be pretty normal. You can learn things from your family members. You don't if your family is not together. And the church, similarly, has lost some of its role of propagating not just faith, but propagating information that holds the community together. Whatever church or temple we may think of, whatever religion you may think of. But here I think I am allowed to say this. I grew up Catholic. This is a Jesuit university. There are some religions that have been very invested in education. Not every organized religion is to the same extent, but certainly the Jesuits are a notable example of still doing this. Other religions do not play that role anymore, and even Catholicism does not play that role anymore around the world. That was an institution that really did, I believe, really did care for poor people, that really did care for educating people, that really was not just about the elite and maintaining the elite, although they themselves are an elite. The church is a very wealthy institution and is populated by a lot of rich white people. But on balance, I believe that some other older institutions, church, family, university, deserve to be defended against the unfair accusations. There are accusations against all of these institutions that we all know. There's a lot of things wrong that can be corrected, hopefully. But I think that's part of the situation where we find ourselves in with irreversible globalization of the way that we live, of the way that goods are made and circulated, of the way that information is circulated. That can't be taken back. So any of these local institutions, any of these cohesions of small communities around a church, around a school, around a city hall, have been disrupted, have been displaced by things like social media. And I don't mean to sound like social media is all bad either, but it certainly is less of an institution that we identify with as something that binds us back onto a tradition, that binds us together as a multi-generational unit, that carries us when we are sick or disadvantaged or when we fall ill, right? Most people hesitate to even post about their own problems on social media because everybody else seems to have no problems, right? Other institutions accept that we have problems, that we have faults, that we have made mistakes. Social media is not particularly where you want to turn with, my face looks terrible today, or the last meal I had was not pretty, or whatever. You never see that on social media. You only see everybody else being perfect. right? So it's not an institution that is inclusive and caring people or uplifting people or education in that sense. So it can take on many roles of older institutions, but not that. Right? What do we do about that? I think one of the answers is that education needs to be public, not exclusive. It needs to be inclusive. It needs to be for everybody who seeks it and qualifies for it. And I think around the world we see that there's more demand than is being met by institutions because there's not often the political will for the state to fund that. I live in a state, in California, where a lot of people think they can attend educational institutions for free, but it used to be free, and it's no longer free. When I started teaching in 2004, the tuition levels were about a seventh of what they are now at the university. I still believe that as expensive as that university has become, it's still a public university. I still believe that it serves the people of the state of California, but it's become really expensive. It used to be free. People who attended it for free are walking around. This is not an ancient story. They're in their working years. They're not even retired yet. But they as collectively as voters have not agreed to fund the university at that level for a much larger number of students. So that kind of lack of social inclusion or of lack of loyalty, lack of transgenerational support is one problem. On the other hand, it is entirely plausible that somebody will find, maybe under the pressure of the coronavirus and other problems, lack of attack space, that somebody will find a way to use the internet in a much better educational mode. So far, what I've seen of online education does not impress. People drop out. People don't have enough of a peer group. You learn as much from each other as you learn from the person in front. So if you don't contact your peer group in an effective way in an online class, you're already not getting the class. Right? This is the least effective transmission of knowledge. One to many, we know that, right? The internet is not a one-to-many medium. There's not one person speaking and you are all on the internet. No, the internet is everybody talking to everybody, right? That's its upside. Once we can try to find a way to harness that for educational attainment, for an inclusive thing that doesn't seem to be biased for or against certain kinds of people with certain kinds of background, then we would have a breakthrough. But so far, unfortunately, the history of the internet has been, had an experimental optimistic phase for about a decade. It was carried heavily economically by the US government. Then it had a decade of wild experimentation in the direction of privatization and internationalization. So from the 70s and 80s on, it became something around the globe that people wanted to localize, make their own, create a Brazilian, a German, a Russian presence on the internet. So it's not just a US type that supported large research institutions primarily. And since the privatization of the backbone in the early 90s, we've seen this kind of hyper-capitalist internet that is mostly about extracting the fastest profit from the largest number of people. And it has greatly enriched a very small number of people in ways that are unheard of in the history of humanity. To become a multi-billionaire at the age of 23 is obscene, Mark Zuckerberg. That should not be correct. And that should not happen. I'm sorry. There's no reason. I admire a lot of people who become successful and wealthy, but there's nothing to admire here. It's pure exploitation. There's no merit behind that level of enrichment. And you can get lucky, fine. Maybe you'll be lucky and you become a millionaire, no resentment there. But a multi-billionaire by age 23, something is wrong. I just don't believe that is defendable. defensible. That should be shared with everybody who helps create that monster. It's a monster. You know? It should not be a reward for very few people who have become so wealthy that they could buy their own planet if there was one. You know, Elon Musk said today that he's very upset that his employees are not working fast enough to get him to Mars before he dies. You know, that's the kind of attitude I find not defensible. You know, I want the internet to be something that really promises on that earlier idealism, as exaggerated, as naive as that may have been, that it's going to be something that connects people. That it's going to be, we've had that idealism in media history for a long time. 100 years ago, Paul Oetlé, who was a librarian in Belgium, not quite 100 years, 90 years ago, under the impression that the First World War was an out pacifist, and said, you know, I'm going to turn my librarian skills to this project of connecting people. And he started an institution together with another similarly privileged boy, two young men in Belgium, started an institution called the Mundaneum, which is basically a proto-internet. They wanted to have workstations accessible to everybody in every city, collecting the information that experts have put together. They benefit greatly if they can share their knowledge across language boundaries, across cultural boundaries. They can educate more people rather than just locally where they are, etc. So, you know, that's a vision that we've had for almost a century now. That's an expectation that we had from the internet. And to that extent, I think the internet is a great letdown. It's a great disappointment. The internet has brought many great things to, it has brought even me to Brazil. So I'm happy about a lot of things the internet has done for me personally. And I like talking about it, but there are certain things about it that are really wrong. The distribution of power, the distribution of wealth on the internet and through the internet is a particularly obvious problem. There are some other problems that are less obvious. And I'm not an economist or a political scientist, so I don't talk about those things as much, but thank you for prompting me to talk about it a little bit. I am mostly a historian of media, which is why I mostly take the approach I took yesterday and today, trying to tell you a longer history of secrecy, of privacy, of disinformation, of fake news, so that you, as somebody who lives with this now, can have at least a historical perspective that gives you some critical options, that lets you sort out whether, as a citizen and as a scholar, you will pursue this or that approach, whether you will favor, let's say, a governmental or a corporate approach to this particular issue, whether you will want to agitate in your local community or in your educational institutions for this or that approach. I'm hoping that with all my sometimes preachy attitude, I'm not telling you what to think, but I'm just giving you options of how to think about these things. Which is why even when I will get to human rights and access questions, I'm going to try to be balanced between the pro and con. I used to sometimes, when I do this at home in California, invite people from those companies that I like to rail against, so that they're on stage with me, and I can just be the grumpy old me, and they can defend what they do for a living in digital marketing, in working for Facebook, in working for YouTube, etc. So believe it or not, even though I'm pretty negative here in Brazil, I do have friends who work for those companies, and I do invite them to speak to my students. But you know, we all have the rights to our opinions, and I'm hoping that my opinion is a relatively informed opinion. But I do also hope that you have some points of disagreement with me, and that you will eventually find the courage, not just to ask a question and pushing me further, but maybe to even disagree with me, because there's a lot that we can all learn, a lot that I need to learn about how this looks to you, how media function in Brazil, how social media function in Brazil, how social media may have a political role in Brazil, how life looks to you as a researcher in an institution in a country ruled by Bolsonaro and his party, etc. I'm curious about that. I need to learn about that. I'm not just here to hold a monologue. I'm here to be in a dialogue. Because if I go home and I've learned nothing about universities and politics here, then I'll have regrets. But thank you for now. I think we're well out of time. And some of you may have to catch shuttles and buses and dinners and so on. But is there one more comment or question? Two.
Na verdade, eu queria só colocar uma questão histórica do Brasil, já que tu comentou que gosta de saber algumas coisas assim. Eu acho que essa questão da desinformação é bem presente na história e que a gente estuda desde criança, porque em 1937 a gente teve uma Constituição Federal baseada na época numa fake news, num plano, supostamente num plano feito por comunistas para dominar o Brasil. E a gente teve toda uma Constituição feita em cima disso. Então, caso seja de interesse, depois pesquisar um pouco e daqui a pouco até adicionar nos slides, porque eu acho que é algo que é grande, né? Não foi uma coisa pequena, uma Constituição inteira feita em cima disso, né? Então, só para colocar.
Thank you. I need to find out more about that. Yeah.
Eu vou tentar ser sucinto. Eu tenho uma pergunta e desculpa se eu estiver sendo um pouco redundante, mas enfim, só para contextualizar minha pergunta. Eu pesquiso sobre distopia e, enfim, eu estou pesquisando sobre as lógicas das distopias nas narrativas ficcionais, principalmente no cinema. E aí, quando eu pensava em distopia, as coisas que eu mais pensava era controle, era censura, era o uso da força, enfim, esses aspectos mais visíveis, né? E aí, quando eu fui me aprofundando na pesquisa, eu comecei a perceber que a informação tem um papel fundamental nessas distopias. A manipulação da informação, a desinformação, as fake news, então todas essas informações que de uma forma um pouco mais expressiva ou um pouco mais, como a gente fala assim, nas entrelinhas, assim, de uma forma mais sutil, essas informações são usadas para manipular a população, né? Então, enfim, eu percebo assim, comecei a perceber que a desinformação, assim, colocando nesse grupo geral, usando essa palavra para agrupar todas essas manipulações de informação como desinformação, são parte importante dessas distopias. E aí, assim, a outra contextualização é eu acho que os contextos onde surgem essas narrativas interferem muito na forma como essas narrativas são construídas. E no momento atual, a gente está vivendo uma situação assim, eu acredito que nos Estados Unidos esteja até uma forma parecida, assim, mas só para citar um exemplo aqui no Brasil, por exemplo, o presidente anunciou há poucos dias que ele tem informações sigilosas de que ele teria ganho no primeiro turno. Ele acabou não ganhando no primeiro turno da eleição, ele foi para o segundo turno, né, mas ele tem informações sigilosas e que ele iria compartilhar isso. E aí nós estamos num ponto, assim, até eu acho que a gente está quase beirando o caos, eu não quero ser muito pessimista, mas a gente quase beira o caos, porque o governo faz muito disso, assim, de soltar informações que depois o governo e vários políticos fazem isso, soltar informações que depois são contrariadas por fatos, né? Existe uma checagem de fatos, só que esses fatos já não importam mais. O que importa é toda a repercussão que deu por causa disso. Então, não importa se essas informações são falsas, se for provado que não existem essas informações ou que essas informações são totalmente mentirosas. O que importa é, ele colocou a dúvida sobre o processo. Então, ele já colocou não só a dúvida sobre o processo que foi, mas o processo que virá. Então, assim, a minha pergunta é tomando isso como contexto. Então, assim, eu acabo, por causa da minha pesquisa, por causa da situação, tendo um olhar um pouco negativo. Então, a minha pergunta é, a gente percebe como vendo tudo que você apresentou, a gente percebe que o uso a manipulação das informações não é uma coisa que veio agora com a internet, é muito mais antigo, né? Mas eu tenho uma visão que é um pouco negativa. Eu queria saber se realmente, se você, pessoalmente, como pesquisador, acredita que existe uma possibilidade, possibilidades de realmente dar a volta por cima, contrariar isso, assim, porque existem opções que pode ser feito, mas talvez a gente está num rio assim que a gente vai tenta ir contra a correnteza e talvez a gente não consegue. Parece que a gente vai ser levado sempre por esse caminho, aí a gente não sabe a que ponto a gente vai chegar.
Thank you for that. I've heard a little bit about that. I won't pretend that I understand the situation here very well, but I heard a little bit about that, and it seems to be, to me as an outsider, very much the same playbook as you see with Berlusconi in Italy, with Orban in Hungary, with populists all across Europe, all across America, all across other parts of the world. So that's both disappointing and kind of ludicrous in some ways. That you can see that we know that that was wrong when it happened over there, and yet it seems to work again in the United States and again in Brazil. And just like I said, I think there was a previous slide, right? If in this case, it's not even an insidious manipulation of somebody in your community. It is the political apparatus itself that undermines your trust in democracy, in elections, and pretends or alleges or promises to disclose secret information about the election that had not gone according to the rules. That's exactly that kind of distinction that Bruce Schneier wants to make between common knowledge that we can all agree on and trust, a process, even though we don't always like the result of the process. The loser needs to believe in it too, not just the winner, right? And the moment you have a process that is not credible to both sides or multiple sides, that's when these institutions break down. That's when we lose faith in an election process. We've seen this in Mexico, allegations that multiple elections in Mexico have been stolen in various ways. Mexico is not one of those countries that should be easily manipulated. Brazil is not one of those. These are large, large countries with long established critical media and other institutions. It's not like you steal, a small, what Americans like to call banana republic, even though you can't say that anymore because it's now a clothing store chain, right? But anyway, disrespectful rhetoric aside, these are not, Hungary is not a country that should be that easily manipulated. Italy has 2,000 or 3,000 years of political manipulations behind it. How can this happen? How can this happen again and again? It should have ended with Caesar. It should not work again. But the playbook seems to work. So that's the first problem that you're pointing to. If we find it ludicrous somewhere else, how come we allow it to happen in our own turf? Right? We can make fun of this in other countries, and then suddenly when it's Trump or Bolsonaro, we're like, can't be, right? So part of that is rhetoric. Part of that is simply the Orwellian rhetoric of turning it around and saying, no, I'm not the person who's spreading lies and fake news. All of the good news is spreading lies and fake news, and I'm the only one who's trustworthy. That should be a ludicrous move, but it somehow worked, right? By sheer courage, by sheer daring. Some politicians carry that off. But they're also enabled. They're supported by the fact that the internet is biased in favor of things that are called clickbait. I don't know if you can translate clickbait into Portuguese effectively, but it's basically anything that outrages, anything that gets attention is going to do better than something that is correct, fair, factual, and balanced. Right? Because that gets more eyeballs, which is how the internet funds itself. Advertising-supported internet that is free. Now she's left, but we want all her family members to have access to inexpensive or free information. The only way that seems to be possible right now is if there is a marketing power behind it, an advertising power behind it, which already undermines some of the neutrality of the information that is being spread. So outrage sells, right? The people used to say sex sells or blood sells or whatever, which is why evening news always start with some accident or something terrible, because even though that's not ostensibly, if I asked you all what you want to see on the news, that's not what you would list. But collectively, we act in such a way that that beast needs to be fed. We want to know that something bad has happened, right? If your evening and TV news were all about the good things that have been done today, I don't know if the same number of people would tune in, right? So there seems to be some kind of dynamic in media that acts against our own better interests and better instincts. And the other aspect of your comment is something that I'm hoping, as I said, we'll get into when we talk about human rights and when we talk about humanitarian interests and when we talk about why that isn't something that we can, not even that is something we can universally agree on. There's going to be ideological differences around that, and there's going to be, the consequences of organizing that politically. So I don't want to talk about the next talk just yet, but I'm hoping that the bridge to that next topic is now more or less obvious and a given. I'm going to have to learn quite a lot more about how the Bolsonaro playbook resembles or differs from the Trump playbook or differs from all the other populist politicians around the world who seem to be engaging in similar games. But I think that the Bruce Schneier article that I'm going to make available to you is one pretty convincing way to think through this, to think through why a more open and more democratic country is more vulnerable to this, and why an autocratic country is currently less vulnerable to this. But the moment you turn that democratic and open American system into an autocratic one, it should work the other way. So we'll see. We'll see whether you're convinced by that analysis or not. But I found it pretty compelling as an analysis of why democracies seem to be shooting themselves in the foot currently, or allowing the internet to poison their well. But I think I'm kind of out of steam tonight, so let's continue the next time when I talk about human rights and the internet, and keep coming back with information that adds to my picture, or maybe even with disagreement, because I do come from a different perspective, from a European and American perspective, that cannot be the one that is yours. I'm hoping that you see things differently, so that I can learn something too, and I can learn about my bias at least. So, thank you for now.